Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. My name is Eli Markham, and I've spent 15 years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. The cab of my Peterbilt 389 has been more of a home to me than any apartment I've rented. I've seen every kind of weather, driven every type of terrain, and learned to handle whatever the road throws at me. At least that's what I believed until October 15th, 2023. The incident happened on Route 200 in Montana, a stretch of highway the locals call the Lonely Road. It's not hard to understand why. The route winds through dense forest and mountain passes, with towns sometimes spaced 100 miles apart. Cell service is spotty at best, and the few gas stations you'll find are the kind that still use mechanical pumps and close at sunset. I was hauling a load of industrial equipment from Seattle to Minneapolis, running behind schedule due to unexpected maintenance in Missoula. The sun had already begun its descent behind the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and purple. My dispatcher, Ron, had warned me about a storm system moving in from the northwest. "Better find somewhere to hunker down for the night, Eli," he'd said during our last radio check. But I was stubborn, convinced I could make it to the next town before the weather hit. The first drops of rain started hitting my windshield around 7:15 p.m. I remember checking my watch because the digital display on my dashboard had been flickering, something that had never happened before. The radio, which had been keeping me company with a local country station, deteriorated into static. Not unusual for these parts, but it left me alone with the rhythmic swish of my wipers in the growing darkness. That's when I saw it. Hazard lights blinking weakly through the rain, about a quarter-mile ahead. An old Ford Crown Victoria, the kind favored by retired police officers, pulled off on the shoulder. In my years on the road, I've helped dozens of stranded motorists. It's an unwritten code among truckers. You stop when you can, because someday you might be the one needing help. I slowed my rig, checking my mirrors out of habit. No other vehicles in sight, just an endless ribbon of wet asphalt disappearing into the gloom behind me. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the roof of my cab like thousands of impatient fingers. Something felt off about the scene as I pulled up behind the Crown Vic. The driver's door was slightly ajar, but the hood was up, blocking any view of the front seat. Standard procedure when I stop to help is to call in my location to dispatch first, but my CB radio produced nothing but static, and my cell phone showed no service typical for this stretch. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, watching the rain create halos around my headlights. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were no footprints in the mud around the car. If someone had gotten out to check the engine, there should have been tracks, but the shoulder was pristine except for the tire marks where the Crown Vic had pulled off. Professional instinct warred with 15 years of experience. The Good Samaritan in me said someone might be in trouble. The veteran trucker said something wasn't right. I decided to split the difference. I'd check it out, but I'd leave my engine running and keep my keys in my pocket. I also grabbed the heavy mag light I keep next to my seat, as much for its weight as its ability to pierce the darkness. The rain plastered my jacket to my shoulders as I approached the Crown Vic. Water streamed off the raised hood, and the hazard lights cast alternating red flashes across the wet pavement. That's when I saw the first detail that turned my concern into dread. Bullet holes, at least 3 of them, clustered in the driver's side window. The glass hadn't shattered completely, but it was webbed with cracks, and darker stains that the rain couldn't quite wash away matted the interior fabric. My heart began to pound, and that sixth sense that long-haul truckers develop was screaming at me to get back in my rig. I took one step backward, then another, trying to keep my movements calm and deliberate despite the adrenaline surging through my system. That's when I heard it, a sound almost lost in the rainfall, a twig snapping in the forest beside the road. The figure that emerged from the tree line moved with an unnatural fluidity that immediately set off alarm bells in my mind. Average height, maybe 5'10", but rail thin, wearing what looked like layers of weather-beaten clothing. In the alternating flash of the hazard lights, I could see that his face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with deep-set eyes that reflected the red glow like a nocturnal animal's. He didn't walk so much as glide across the shoulder, his movements too smooth for the uneven ground. Everything about him was wrong. The angle of his head, the way his arms hung at his sides, the complete lack of reaction to the pouring rain. But what disturbed me most was his unwavering focus. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking through me, as if I were merely an obstacle between him and something else. Training and experience kicked in. Rule number 1 of highway safety: when threatened, your truck is your best defense. I began backing toward my rig, keeping my eyes on the approaching figure while fumbling with my keys. The distance between us couldn't have been more than 30 feet, but it felt like miles. The stranger's pace quickened with each step I took backward, but he maintained that same fluid motion, like someone had pressed fast forward on a video. His head remained perfectly still while his legs ate up the distance between us. I could see his face more clearly now, skin pulled too tight across sharp cheekbones, lips drawn back in what might have been a smile but looked more like a grimace. I reached my truck and yanked open the door, practically throwing myself into the cab. My trembling hands fought with the lock as the figure closed the distance. The sound of the deadbolt clicking into place was immediately followed by a thud against the driver's side door that shook the entire cab. What happened next defied everything I know about physics and human capability. The man, if that's what he was, began pounding on the door with enough force to dent the metal. Each impact reverberated through the cab like a sledgehammer strike. I could see his face pressed against my window, those reflective eyes now inches from mine, that rictus grin stretching impossibly wide. I slammed the truck into gear and floored the accelerator. 600 horses roared to life, and my tires sprayed gravel as they fought for traction on the wet shoulder. The figure disappeared from my window, but in my mirrors, I could see him running behind the truck with that same unnatural speed, closing the gap despite my increasing velocity. The next curve in the road took me out of sight of the Crown Vic, and when I checked my mirrors again, the figure was gone. Relief flooded through me for a brief moment, until I heard something moving in the sleeper berth behind me. A sharp intake of breath that wasn't mine, the rustle of fabric, the creak of weight shifting on my bunk. The next few minutes remain a blur in my memory. I remember seeing signs for the town of Wolf Point ahead, my speedometer pushing 90 despite the rain and darkness. The local police station appeared like a beacon of hope, its lights cutting through the gloom. I barely remember pulling into the lot or running inside, my words tumbling out in a barely coherent stream as I tried to explain what had happened to the desk sergeant. 2 officers, Ramirez and Keller, according to their nameplates, took my statement. They listened patiently as I described the Crown Vic, the bullet holes, the strange man, and the sounds from my sleeper berth. I could see the skepticism in their eyes, the kind reserved for truckers who've been on the road too long or had too many energy drinks. But something changed when I mentioned the location. Ramirez and Keller exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. They asked me to wait while they checked my truck. 20 minutes later, they returned with grim expressions. "Mr. Markham," Officer Ramirez began, "we found evidence of forced entry on your driver's side door, dents and scrapes consistent with your story. But there was no one in the sleeper berth." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "However, we did find this." She placed an evidence bag on the desk. Inside was a torn piece of fabric soaked with rain and something darker. It matched the layers of clothing I'd seen on the figure. "There's something else you should know," Officer Keller added. "That stretch of Route 200 has a history. Local folks call it Thomas's Road, after Thomas Hewitt, a former resident who disappeared 10 years ago after a series of violent incidents. His body was never found, but his Crown Victoria was discovered abandoned near where you stopped tonight." They told me more about Hewitt, how he'd been a recluse living in a cabin off the highway, how he'd developed increasingly erratic behavior after losing his job at the local lumber mill, how he'd begun fixating on passing motorists before his disappearance. The official theory was that he died in the woods, but his body was never recovered despite extensive searches. The officers arranged for me to stay at a local motel that night. They advised me to take a different route when I resumed my journey, though we all knew that wasn't really an option in my line of work. Before I left, Officer Ramirez gave me her card and made me promise to call if I remembered anything else. That was 6 months ago. I still drive the same routes, still haul the same loads, But something changed that night. I installed additional locks on my cab doors and a security camera system that monitors both inside and outside my truck. I don't stop for broken down vehicles after dark anymore. I call in their location to highway patrol instead. Sometimes, on long hauls through remote areas, I'll catch movement in my mirrors that doesn't quite match the motion of my truck, or I'll hear something that might be more than just the wind against my cab. In those moments, I remember Officer Keller's parting words. "Mr. Markham, in all the years since Hewitt disappeared, you're the first person who stopped at that Crown Vic and lived to tell about it. The truth is, everyone thinks they understand the dangers of life on the road, the weather, the fatigue, the mechanical failures. But there are other dangers out there, things that lurk in the spaces between cities, in the darkness beyond our headlights. I've seen one of them face to face, and I pray I never do again. These days, when I pass those quirky roadside attractions advertising local mysteries and legends, I don't smile anymore, because I know that sometimes the real horrors aren't the ones in tourist trap museums or on faded billboards. They're the ones waiting on lonely stretches of highway, wearing human shapes, but moving within human grace, watching for lights to slow down and kind souls to stop and help. I still drive the long-haul routes. It's my life, my livelihood. But now I know that safety isn't a guarantee. It's a gift that can be snatched away in an instant by things that shouldn't exist but do. Whether they're flesh and blood or something else entirely, doesn't matter much when you're alone on a dark road, watching your mirrors, and praying that the movement you just saw was just a trick of the light, because sometimes it isn't. The human mind is strange when you're alone on the road. Time becomes elastic, stretching and contracting like a rubber band. The date was October 15th, 2018, and that night changed everything I understood about reality. My name's Kellen Walsh, and I've spent 23 years driving routes most people wouldn't touch. Before that, I wore a badge for the Chicago PD, but that life seems like ancient history now. I was 48 then, old enough to know better, but still young enough to make stupid decisions. The kind of decisions that come back to haunt you when the sun goes down and you're alone with your thoughts. The first thing they teach you about long-haul driving is that routine keeps you alive. You check your mirrors every 30 seconds. You stop every few hours, whether you need to or not. You keep your logbook current. But routine can also kill you, lulling you into a false sense of security until something breaks through. That October night started like any other. I was hauling industrial equipment from Seattle to Minneapolis, taking Interstate 90 through Montana. The cab of my Peterbilt 579 was my second home-worn leather seat molded to my shape, dashboard cluttered with gas station coffee cups, and the constant hum of tires on asphalt serving as my white noise machine. The construction signs appeared around 7:39 p.m., orange diamonds reflecting my headlights like cat's eyes. Roadwork ahead, detour next exit. Standard stuff, nothing to worry about. The state highway they redirected us to wasn't on my usual route, but GPS showed it would eventually loop back to I-90. Just a minor inconvenience, I thought. The prairie stretched endlessly on either side of the two-lane blacktop, dead grass rustling in the wind like whispers. No streetlights out here, just the endless parade of reflective markers and my high beams cutting through the darkness. The moon hung low and bloated in the sky, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. Around 8:10 p.m., the monotony started getting to me. You develop tricks to stay alert during these long stretches. I'd count the seconds between mile markers or make up stories about the few cars I passed. But that night, even my usual mental games weren't enough to keep the fatigue at bay. The turnout appeared like a mirage, a small gravel patch barely wide enough for my rig. My bladder had been complaining for the last 20 miles, so I pulled over, making sure my hazards were flashing. Standard procedure, even though I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. That's when I first noticed something was off. The air felt different here, heavier somehow, like the moments before a thunderstorm. But the sky was clear, stars scattered across the black expanse like spilled salt. As I walked to the edge of the turnout, my boots crunching on gravel, I saw it. The shrine wasn't large, maybe 3 feet tall at most. Someone had carefully stacked flat rocks into a crude pyramid, securing them with what looked like sinew or gut. At the top sat what I initially thought was an animal skull, bleached white by the sun. But as I moved closer, my flashlight beam catching it at different angles, I realized it was human. The skull wasn't the only thing wrong with that shrine. Woven through the rocks were strips of fabric. What I first thought was colored yarn turned out to be pieces of clothing, frayed and weathered but still recognizable. A fragment of blue denim, a strip of what might have been a red dress, a piece of a leather work glove, cracked and stiff with age. Each piece had been deliberately placed, tied into complex knots that reminded me of the friendship bracelets my daughter used to make before the divorce. 20 years of police work teaches you to trust your instincts. Mine were screaming at me to get back in the truck and drive. But that same top instinct that got me into trouble back in Chicago kept me rooted there, playing my flashlight beam across the shrine. Something about those fabric strips bothered me. They weren't old enough. Everything else about the shrine looked ancient, but those pieces of clothing couldn't have been there more than a few months. I pulled out my phone, thinking I should document this. No signal. Not unusual out here in the middle of nowhere. I took a few photos anyway, though something in the back of my mind told me they wouldn't turn out. Looking back, I wish I'd listened to that voice. The wind picked up as I walked back to the truck, bringing with it a smell that didn't belong. Most people think the prairie is odorless, but you get to know its scents. Sage, dust, the occasional whiff of cattle from distant ranches. This was different, organic, wrong, like turning over a log and finding something decomposing underneath. Back in the cab, I tried to shake off the unease. Probably just some local kids playing pranks, or maybe a memorial site I didn't understand. The clock read 9:17 p.m. I had another 4 hours of driving ahead of me if I wanted to stay on schedule. The highway stretched ahead, empty and dark. The moon had disappeared behind clouds that hadn't been there before, leaving only my headlights to cut through the darkness. I clicked on the radio, hoping to find something to keep me company. Static, all frequencies. Not even the usual late-night preachers or country music that usually filtered through out here. By 10:30 p.m., my eyes were starting to burn. The white lines on the road seemed to writhe like snakes, and twice I caught myself drifting toward the shoulder. When the sign for a rest stop appeared, it felt like divine intervention. Truck parking 1 mile. Simple block letters, reflective paint catching my headlights, standard DOT sign, nothing special about it. Except, I could have sworn it wasn't there when my lights first hit it. The rest stop was bigger than I expected. A sprawling gravel lot with spaces for at least 20 rigs. 3 other trucks were already parked for the night, their cabs dark. I pulled into a spot near the middle, backing in with the practice of thousands of similar stops. Force of habit made me check my mirrors as I cut the engine. That's when I noticed something odd. The other trucks didn't have any markings. No company logos, no DOT numbers, just plain white trailers like props on a movie set. I should have noticed sooner, should have kept driving. But fatigue does strange things to your mind, makes you dismiss the obvious warning signs. I heated up a microwave dinner chicken and mashed potatoes that tasted like the container they came in, and settled into my bunk for the night. The routine was comforting. Check the doors, locked, place my gun in easy reach, old habits, set the alarm for 5 a.m. Sleep came quickly, but it didn't last. I woke to the sound of scratching, not the gentle scrape of tree branches. There weren't any trees here anyway, but deliberate, methodical scratching, like someone dragging their nails across the truck's aluminum panels. The sound moved slowly around the vehicle, punctuated by something that might have been breathing or might have been the wind. The dashboard clock read 2:17 a.m. The lot was pitch black. Even the safety lights that usually illuminate these places were out. I lay perfectly still in my bunk, listening to that scratching make its way around my truck. My hand found the grip of my Glock, the familiar texture bringing little comfort. The scratching stopped at my door. For a long moment there was only silence, then a thud on the roof, heavy footsteps moving with purpose. The whole truck shook with each impact. Training kicked in. I moved to the driver's seat, gun ready, and hit the high beams. The figure that dropped in front of my truck was wrong in every way that mattered. 7 feet tall at least, but the proportions were off. Arms too long, joints bending in ways they shouldn't. The deer skin around its waist looked fresh, still dripping. Its face, what I could see of it through the matted hair and beard, was almost human. Almost. But the eyes reflected my headlights like an animal's, and the teeth. God, the teeth were all wrong, like someone had jammed broken glass into its gums. It smiled at me. That's what broke me. Not the size, not the wrongness of its movement, but that smile. Like it knew me. Like it had been waiting. I threw the truck into gear just as it reached for the door handle. The metal screamed as those claws dug in, leaving deep furrows in the steel. The engine roared and I floored it, feeling resistance as the creature held on, then sudden release as I hit the highway. In my mirrors I saw it standing in the middle of the road, not chasing, not moving at all, just watching, smiling that glass-toothed smile. I drove straight through until dawn, crossing the state line into North Dakota as the sun came up, pulled into a busy truck stop, ordered the biggest coffee they had, and finally looked at my truck in the daylight. The claw marks were gone. Not faded or repaired. Gone, like they'd never existed. My phone showed no photos from the shrine, just an error message about corrupted files. I filed a police report in Bismarck. The officers were professional, took down every detail, promised to investigate. A week later they called to tell me they'd found the rest stop. Empty gravel lot, no signs of damage, no other reports of strange sightings. They suggested stress, fatigue, maybe road hypnosis. That was 6 years ago. I still drive, but never that route. Never at night if I can help it. I've learned every bypass and alternate road between Seattle and Minneapolis. The company thinks I'm eccentric. Let them. Because sometimes on long nights when I'm parked at a crowded truck stop, I catch a whiff of that wrong smell. And in my mirrors, just at the edge of the lot where the light doesn't quite reach, I see something tall standing very still, watching. Waiting. I know what it wants. It's the same thing it wanted that night, to show me that all our rules, all our civilized explanations and logical assumptions are just a thin veneer. There are older things out there in the dark spaces between cities, things that remember when they were gods, things that are patient, and sometimes they get hungry for more than just flesh. By the time I finally decided to share this story, 3 years had passed since that day in the Cibola National Forest. I'm Elvin Archer, and I've spent most of my life in New Mexico. Anyone who knows me will tell you I'm not the type to exaggerate or chase attention. Before everything happened, I was just another guy trying to make ends meet, working as a mechanic at Martinez Auto in Albuquerque, living paycheck to paycheck in a small apartment off Central Avenue. The events I'm about to describe took place in October 2021. I remember the date clearly because it was right after I'd finished a particularly rough month at work. We'd lost 2 mechanics to better paying jobs in Santa Fe, which meant longer hours for those of us who remained. Between the stress of covering extra shifts and the mounting bills, I felt like I was drowning in the monotony of everyday life. Hunting had always been my escape. There's something about being alone in the wilderness that helps put things in perspective. I'd been going to Cibola since I was a kid, learned every trail and ridge from my father before he passed. The familiar scent of pine needles and juniper, the way the sun painted the mountains gold at dawn. It was home in a way my apartment never could be. I planned the trip meticulously as I always did. 5 days of solitude, just me and my Winchester Model 70 in .30.06, the same rifle I'd used for the past decade. I'd chosen a remote area in the Mount Taylor Ranger District, about 3 hours from Albuquerque. It was elk season, and I had my license, but honestly the hunt was secondary to simply getting away from everything. The drive out was uneventful. I took Highway 40 west, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of amber and rose. The radio kept cutting out as I got further from civilization, static eventually replacing the morning news entirely. By the time I turned onto Forest Road 193, the sun was high enough to cast sharp shadows through the ponderosa pines. My usual camping spot was about 2 miles up an old logging trail, far enough from the main road that I rarely saw another person. The October air was crisp, hovering around 65 degrees when I started setting up camp. I had my routine down to a science: tent first, then the fire pit, followed by securing my food in a bear-proof container well away from where I'd be sleeping. Everything felt normal at first. The familiar sounds of birds, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the wind through the trees. It was exactly what I'd come for. But as the afternoon wore on, something began to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a creeping sensation at the base of my skull, like when you think someone's watching you. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the stress from work following me into the wilderness. I spent the remainder of the daylight gathering firewood and setting up my hunting blind about half a mile from camp, overlooking a small meadow where I'd seen elk sign in previous years. That first night, the temperature dropped to near freezing, typical for October in these mountains. I had a small fire going and was heating up some beef stew I'd brought when I first noticed the silence. It came on gradually. First the crickets stopped, then the nocturnal birds fell quiet. Anyone who spent time in the wilderness knows that sudden silence usually means a predator is nearby. Mountain lions aren't uncommon in these parts, so I made sure my rifle was within reach and added more wood to the fire. But this silence felt different, heavier somehow. Even the wind seemed to die, leaving nothing but the soft crackle of my campfire and the thundering of my own heartbeat in my ears. I've experienced similar situations before, the woods going quiet when a bear or mountain lion passes through, but they never lasted more than a few minutes. This silence stretched on for hours. I barely slept that night, drifting in and out of uneasy consciousness, jerking awake at every snap of a twig or shift of the wind. By morning I was exhausted and irritable, angry at myself for letting paranoia get the better of me. The familiar sounds of the forest had returned with the dawn, making the previous night's anxiety seem foolish in the harsh light of day. I decided to hunt anyway, figuring the physical activity would help clear my head. The morning was cold, my breath forming thick clouds as I made my way to the blind I'd set up the previous day. The sun was just beginning to peek over the eastern ridge, casting long shadows through the trees. Perfect hunting conditions. For 3 hours, I sat in complete stillness, watching the meadow for any sign of movement. The only wildlife I saw were a few Steller's jays and a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. Around mid-morning I decided to try still hunting, moving slowly through the woods, stopping frequently to scan for game. I headed northeast, working my way up a gentle slope where the ponderosa pines gave way to spruce and fir. The ground was carpeted with fallen needles, making it easier to move quietly. The air had warmed to maybe 50 degrees, and a slight breeze carried the scent of sage and pine. Under normal circumstances, it would have been perfect. That's when I caught the first whiff of it, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach turn. Anyone who's ever stumbled across a rotting carcass knows the smell, but this was different. There was something else mixed in, something chemical, almost like burning plastic. Training and experience told me to back away slowly, to return to camp and try a different area. But something else, something deeper and more primal, urged me forward. It was like being pulled by an invisible thread, my feet moving almost of their own accord toward the source of that horrific smell. The forest had gone silent again, but I was too focused on what lay ahead to fully register it at the time. I moved carefully, each step measured and deliberate, my rifle held ready. The smell grew stronger as I approached a small clearing, and that's when I saw it, the elk carcass. What was left of it anyway? I've field-dressed countless animals over the years. I've seen what bears and mountain lions can do to a carcass. This was different. The elk had been opened. That's the only word I can think of that comes close to describing it. It wasn't torn apart or mauled. It was precisely split, like someone had unzipped it from throat to tail. The organs were laid out in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, each one placed with careful precision on the blood-soaked ground. My first thought was that this must be the work of humans, poachers maybe, or some sick individual with too much time on their hands. But as I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I heard movement behind me. The sound was subtle, just the soft whisper of something moving through the underbrush. but in the absolute silence that had fallen over the forest, it might as well have been a gunshot. I turned slowly, my rifle already halfway to my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. What emerged from the trees defied everything I knew about the natural world. At first glance it appeared almost human, bipedal, roughly 6 feet tall, with a head, torso, and limbs. But that's where any resemblance to humanity ended. Its skin was a sickly pale gray, stretched too tight over an impossibly thin frame. The proportions were all wrong, arms too long, fingers like spiders' legs ending in dark curved points. Its joints bent in ways that shouldn't be possible, like there were extra segments in its limbs. But it was the face that haunts me most. The eyes were set too far apart, larger than human eyes should be, and completely black, except for pinpricks of amber light in their centers. The nose was just 2 vertical slits, and below that, God, that mouth. It split the face in a grotesque parody of a smile, filled with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth, like a shark's mouth stretched across a human face. Our eyes met, and in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at something intelligent. There was calculation in those eyes, a cold awareness that turned my blood to ice. The creature tilted its head at an impossible angle, studying me with an almost clinical detachment. Then it moved. The speed was incredible. One moment it was 20 feet away, the next it was barely 5. I raised my rifle and fired without conscious thought. The shot echoed through the silent forest like a thunderclap. I know I hit it. Saw the impact just below its right shoulder, but it didn't bleed. The bullet hole just closed like water rippling back together. That's when I ran. I'd like to say I made a strategic retreat, that I kept my head and moved with purpose. But that would be a lie. I ran in blind panic, crashing through the underbrush like a wounded animal. Behind me I could hear it moving, not the sound of footsteps, but a sort of sliding whisper through the trees that somehow seemed worse. The terrain was rough, the ground rising sharply as I fled uphill. My lungs burned with each breath and my legs felt like lead. I still had my rifle clutched in a white-knuckled grip, but I knew now it would be useless against whatever was pursuing me. That's when I made my first mistake. I looked back. It was moving through the trees in a way that denied physics, its body twisting and flowing like smoke, but somehow solid. Those amber eyes locked onto mine again, and its mouth split wider in what I can only describe as anticipation. My second mistake came immediately after. With my attention behind me, I missed the root jutting from the ground. My foot caught it hard and I went down. The impact drove the air from my lungs and I felt something snap in my ankle. The pain was immediate and intense, but the adrenaline coursing through my system pushed it to the background. I scrambled to my feet, now limping heavily. The thing was closer now, moving with that same fluid grace. But it wasn't rushing to catch me. It was almost playing, like a cat toying with a mouse. That realization somehow made everything worse. What saved me, I think, was the sun. As I stumbled through the forest, I noticed the creature staying to the shadows, never crossing directly through the patches of sunlight that broke through the canopy. Using my hunter's knowledge of the terrain, I made for a clearing I knew was ahead. My ankle screamed with every step, but I forced myself forward. The clearing was maybe 50 yards across, completely exposed to the afternoon sun. I broke through the tree line and half ran, half crawled to the center, finally collapsing in the grass. For several long minutes, I lay there gasping for breath, expecting at any moment to feel those razor-sharp teeth. But when I finally found the courage to look up, I saw it standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a massive ponderosa pine. It wasn't advancing. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Me in the sunlight, it in the shadows. Those amber eyes never left me, and that terrible smile never wavered. Then, as the sun shifted and shadows began to creep across the clearing, I knew I had to move. Getting back to camp was an ordeal. I used my rifle as a makeshift crutch, keeping to open areas as much as possible. Every shadow made me flinch, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. But somehow, I made it back just as dusk was settling in. I broke down camp in record time, throwing everything haphazardly into my truck. The drive back to Albuquerque was a blur of pain and paranoia, constantly checking my rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was back in the city, surrounded by the comforting glow of streetlights and the sounds of civilization. The next few weeks were hell. I told the guys at work I'd sprained my ankle hiking, but that was the least of my problems. Sleep became almost impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, those teeth, those knowing eyes. I started sleeping with lights on, then stopped sleeping altogether for days at a time. The worst part was the doubt. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Was I losing my mind? I started researching, spending countless hours online looking for anything similar to what I'd encountered. It took months of digging through folklore and historical accounts before I found anything that matched what I'd seen. The Navajo have stories of skinwalkers, Yi-Naldlushi, shape-shifting witches who can take animal form. But what I saw wasn't quite that either. It was something older, something that predated even those ancient tales. I found scattered references in the journals of Spanish explorers from the 1500s, describing encounters with demons that walk like men. The Pueblo peoples had their own stories of creatures that lived in the deep forests, things that were neither human nor animal, but something in between. The more I researched, the more I found similar accounts spanning centuries, different cultures, different names, but always the same basic description: unnaturally tall, pale figures with too many teeth and eyes that held an ancient intelligence. It's been 3 years now and I haven't been back to Cibola. I still hunt, but never alone and never in that part of New Mexico. The ankle healed, though it still aches when the weather changes. The nightmares have mostly subsided, though they never completely go away. But something else has changed, something fundamental. It's like once you've seen behind the curtain, you can't unsee it. I notice things now that I would have missed before. The way shadows sometimes move against the wind, the sudden silences that fall over busy streets for no apparent reason, the glimpses of pale figures in peripheral vision that vanish when you turn to look. I've learned to live with it, this new awareness of a world that exists alongside our own, but separate from it. Most days I can almost convince myself it was all a product of stress and isolation. Almost. But some nights, when I'm driving home late and catch movement in my headlights, or when I wake up at 3 a.m. to complete silence, I remember those amber eyes and that terrible smile, and I know that there are things in this world that we're not meant to understand, ancient things that live in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. I still have my hunting license and my rifle still sits in its case by my bed. But these days I find myself wondering, when I was out there in those woods, was I really the hunter, or was I always the prey? I have never told this story properly before. Maybe that's because I still wake up some nights, heart pounding, thinking I hear that inhuman screech echoing through the Olympic Peninsula rainforest. Or maybe it's because I know how it sounds. A delivery driver, an abandoned house, something that shouldn't exist. But I need to get this down, if only so someone else might learn from my mistakes. Call me Wyatt. You might as well know the name of the dead man walking, right? That's what I considered myself after that day in 2019, when I was 23 and too desperate for cash to listen to my instincts. I was working my way through community college back then, picking up whatever gigs I could find on those delivery apps. The kind where people need something moved from point A to point B, no questions asked. The pay wasn't great, but it beat flipping burgers, and the flexible hours let me attend classes. Most jobs were mundane, helping people move furniture, delivering packages that wouldn't fit in standard mail, that sort of thing. The listing that caught my eye that foggy October morning seemed simple enough. A woman needed an antique doll collection transported from a storage facility in Port Angeles to a remote location near Forks. The pay was better than usual, $300 for what looked like a few hours' work. I should have wondered why. I remember checking my bank account before accepting the job. $46.73. Rent was due in a week. The choice didn't feel like a choice at all. The woman who posted the job, she called herself Miss Green, had a voice that sounded oddly flat over the phone, like someone trying too hard to sound normal. She insisted the delivery had to happen that day before sunset. When I asked why she couldn't pick up the collection herself, she gave some vague excuse about car trouble. I didn't press. Money is money, right? The storage facility was one of those anonymous concrete blocks on the outskirts of town. Unit 237. The manager let me in with barely a glance at my ID. Inside, a single cardboard box sat in the center of the otherwise empty unit. It was larger than I expected, maybe 3 feet on each side, sealed with what looked like excessive amounts of packing tape. No labels, no markings, just a box that felt too heavy for what was supposed to be inside. I should have walked away then, but $300 was $300. The drive started normally enough. Highway 101 hugged the coastline, offering glimpses of the steel-gray Pacific through gaps in the evergreens. The Olympics loomed to the south, their peaks lost in clouds that seemed to be sinking lower by the minute. I had the radio on, some classic rock station that kept cutting out as I got further from civilization. The GPS led me onto progressively smaller roads until I was crawling along what amounted to a logging trail. The forest pressed in close here, massive Sitka spruces and western red cedars draped in hanging moss that seemed to absorb both light and sound. The fog had thickened into a proper soup, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet ahead. My headlights caught the water droplets, creating a disorienting effect like I was driving through static. That's when my phone lost signal. No bars, no data, no GPS. Just a blank screen reflecting my increasingly worried face. I'd written down the directions as a backup, thank God, but being cut off from the outside world made my skin crawl. The box in the truck bed seemed to grow heavier with each mile. I tried to distract myself by texting a joke to my roommate about vampires. This was Twilight Country after all. But the message wouldn't send. It just sat there, mocking me with its failure to deliver. The trees pressed closer, their branches scraping against the sides of my truck like skeletal fingers. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, I found the turnoff Miss Green had described. No mailbox, no house number, just a rutted dirt track barely wide enough for my vehicle. The coordinates matched my written directions, but everything in me screamed to turn around. I wish I had listened. The house appeared suddenly through the fog, a 2-story Victorian that looked like it had been transported straight from a horror movie set. Gray paint peeling, windows dark, wraparound porch sagging like a broken jaw. An old Ford pickup, probably from the 80s, sat in what passed for a driveway, its red paint dulled to the color of dried blood. Rust had eaten through the body in places, and all 4 tires were flat. It clearly hadn't moved in years. No fresh tire tracks in the mud, no lights, no sign anyone lived here at all. I sat in my truck for a long moment, engine idling, watching the fog swirl around the house like it was trying to consume it. The box seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, though I told myself it was just my imagination. The only sound was the tick-tick-tick of my cooling engine and the soft patter of water droplets falling from the trees. Professional obligation finally won out over instinct. I grabbed my flashlight, one of those heavy mag lights that can double as a weapon, and approached the front door. Each step on the porch boards produced a groan that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. I knocked. The sound echoed oddly, like the house was hollow inside. No response. I knocked again, harder this time. Delivery from Miss Green. My voice sounded thin and afraid. That's when I heard it. A scratching sound from inside, like something being dragged across wooden floors. Then a thump. Then silence. "Hello?" I called out, pressing my ear to the door. "I have your package, the doll collection?" More scratching. Closer now. And underneath it, a sound that made my blood run cold. A wet, gurgling moan, barely audible but unmistakably human. Or almost human. I tried the door handle, telling myself I was just being thorough, secretly hoping it would be locked. It wasn't. The door swung open with a creak that would have seemed cliché in any other situation. The smell hit me first, decay and formaldehyde, sweet and chemical and wrong. The entryway was dark. What little daylight made it through the fog revealed shapes covered in dusty sheets. Furniture maybe, or sculptures. Their outlines seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight app. The beam caught dust motes swirling in the air like angry insects. That scratching sound was louder now, coming from what I guessed was the living room. Every horror movie I'd ever seen screamed at me to run, but some morbid curiosity pushed me forward. That, and the thought of that empty bank account. The living room was larger than it should have been, given the house's exterior dimensions. More sheet-covered shapes loomed in the corners, but it was what crouched in the center of the room that turned my world inside out. My flashlight beam caught it in profile first, a thing that had maybe once been human but wasn't anymore. It was naked, its skin a patchwork of different textures and colors, like pieces had been removed and replaced. Where its eyes should have been, something reflective caught the light, like polished coins had been sewn into the sockets. It was hunched over something on the floor, something red and wet that I refused to look at directly. Long, matted hair hung in ropes around its face, and its hands, dear God, its hands were wrong, too many joints, too long, ending in what looked like surgical steel instead of fingernails. Then it turned toward me, and I saw its mouth. No lips, just teeth exposed in a permanent rictus grin, yellow and sharp and too numerous. That mouth opened impossibly wide as it tasted the air, like a snake scenting its prey. I'd like to say I acted with courage or purpose. The truth is, blind panic took over. I tried to run, but tripped over something solid hidden under one of those sheets. I went down hard, my flashlight spinning away across the floor. Its beam caught flashes of movement as the creature launched itself toward me with that spider-like grace. My hand found something solid, a wooden handle, smooth with age. The creature slammed into me, knocking me against the wall hard enough to drive the air from my lungs. Its face was inches from mine now, that lidless gaze boring into me as something wet and gray snaked out from between those teeth. Pure survival instinct took over. I swung whatever I'd grabbed as hard as I could. There was resistance, then a meaty thunk, and the creature released me with a shriek that shattered the nearest window. The sound went straight through my skull like an ice pick, setting my teeth vibrating in their sockets. I scrambled to my feet, still clutching what I now saw was an old wood-cutting axe. The creature was already recovering, moving with jerky, wrong angles as it oriented on me again. Dark fluid leaked from a gash in its shoulder, but the wound was already pulling itself closed like a time-lapse video of healing. I ran. The creature pursued, crashing through the front door like it was made of paper. Splinters showered my face as I sprinted to my truck. The key fumbled in the ignition as that horrible screech came closer. The engine roared to life just as something heavy landed in the truck bed. I floored it, not even thinking about turning around. Branches whipped against the windows as I reversed down that narrow track at speeds that should have killed me. The thing in the back was thrashing, and I heard the sound of tearing cardboard. Another inhuman shriek, this one somehow triumphant. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, and even then I kept going until I reached the first gas station I saw. That's where the adrenaline finally wore off enough for me to really process what had happened. I pulled over and threw up until there was nothing left but bile. When I finally worked up the courage to check the truck bed, the box had been torn to shreds. Whatever had been inside, and they weren't dolls, I can tell you that much, was gone. But there was something else, something that still haunts my dreams. Scattered among the cardboard fragments were what looked like scraps of leather, but the texture was wrong. Some still had hair attached, and there were other things, metal things that gleamed dully in the fluorescent lights of the gas station. Surgical implements, I realized with growing horror. Tools for removing and preserving parts. I called the police, of course. They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't believe me. Can't blame them, really. They sent units out to the house, but by then the fog had lifted and there was nothing to find. No blood, no broken door, no evidence of anyone living there for years. The property records led nowhere. Shell companies within shell companies, dead ends all around. The woman who hired me, the phone number was disconnected, the payment app account deleted. The storage facility manager had no record of Unit 237 being rented that day. It was like the whole thing had been engineered to make me sound crazy. But here's what keeps me up at night. What makes me check and double-check my locks even now. In the years since, I've done research. There are patterns if you know where to look. Missing persons reports in that area going back decades. Always individuals who wouldn't be missed right away. Drifters, solo hikers, people between jobs. The police files mentioned strange wound patterns on the few bodies that were found, like someone had been harvesting. The local indigenous peoples have stories about creatures that walk in human shape but aren't human at all. Things that steal not just lives but identities, building new bodies from stolen parts. The old-timers call that part of the peninsula the hungry ground and won't go near it after dark. I've moved away from Washington State since then, changed my name, went off-grid as much as possible in this connected age. But sometimes when the fog rolls in thick and the shadows grow long, I swear I can hear that scratching sound again. And I wonder, was I allowed to escape that day? Was I meant to spread this story, to attract more curious souls to that hungry ground? Or am I just bait, slowly going mad, waiting for something that wears stolen faces to finally come collect the parts it marked as its own? I don't check delivery apps anymore. Some payments aren't worth the price. It was March 2021 when I spent that fateful time in the Everglades. I was 32 then, working as a freelance web developer in Tampa, and anyone who's ventured into those swamplands will tell you it's like stepping into another world entirely. The Everglades have this ancient quality about them, a primordial atmosphere where you can almost feel time dissolving around you, where alligators still reign supreme just as they have for millions of years. Looking back, I should have recognized that the strangeness of the place wasn't just atmosphere, it was a warning. My name is Elric, and before all this happened, I was your typical tech guy. Spent my days hunched over a laptop, debugging code for clients, and living off coffee and takeout. I wasn't unhappy exactly, but there was this gnawing emptiness that came from spending too many hours staring at screens instead of living. When my cousin Jasper's message popped up on my phone about a week-long backcountry camping trip, it felt like an answer to something I hadn't even known I was asking. Jasper was everything I wasn't, an outdoor enthusiast who worked as a wilderness guide in Colorado. He had this infectious enthusiasm about nature that made even the most mundane hike sound like an epic adventure. "Come on, cuz," he wrote. "Time to disconnect and remember what real life feels like." The timing seemed perfect. I just wrapped up a big project, and the thought of escaping the artificial glow of my monitors was suddenly irresistible. I should have done more research, should have prepared better. But Jasper assured me he knew what he was doing, and I trusted him. We met up in Naples, Florida, where he'd already arranged our gear rental, including a rugged four-wheeler that had seen better days. The rental guy, a weathered local named Roy, gave us an odd look when Jasper mentioned our destination. "You boys heading deep in?" Roy asked, his sun-creased face showing concern. "Might want to reconsider. Had some strange reports lately. Couple of hikers went missing last month." Jasper laughed it off. "We'll be fine. I've got satellite navigation and emergency beacons." Roy shrugged, but I caught something in his expression, a flicker of genuine worry that should have set off alarm bells. Instead, I helped Jasper load our gear: tents, supplies, emergency medical kit, enough food and water for 10 days, but we only planned to stay for 7. The four-wheeler's suspension groaned under the weight. The journey in was grueling. We followed established trails as far as we could, but eventually those gave way to barely marked paths that seemed to disappear entirely at times. The air grew thicker, more oppressive, heavy with the scent of decay and stagnant water. Mosquitoes swarmed us in clouds despite our repellent, and the constant drone of insects created this maddening white noise that made it hard to think. We had to abandon the four-wheeler about 4 miles in, marking its location carefully on our GPS. From there, we shouldered our packs and began the real trek. The water level varied unpredictably, sometimes ankle-deep, sometimes reaching our knees. Every step had to be careful, calculated. Jasper led the way, occasionally consulting his compass and GPS unit, though the tree canopy made satellite reception spotty at best. The first warning signs appeared on our second day of hiking. We found unusual tracks in the mud, too large for a deer, wrong shape for a bear or panther. Jasper suggested it might be from a feral hog, but something about the impression seemed off. The stride length was too long, and there was this strange pattern to them that I couldn't quite place. We made camp that evening on a raised hammock of land, one of the few dry spots we'd found. The setting sun painted everything in shades of amber and shadow, and for a while it felt almost peaceful. Jasper got a small fire going and heated up some freeze-dried meals. We sat there, eating and talking about nothing in particular, while the swamp came alive with night sounds around us. That's when I first noticed the silence. It didn't happen all at once, more like a gradual dimming of the natural chorus of frogs and insects. One moment the air was filled with their calls, and the next, nothing. Complete stillness. Even Jasper noticed it, pausing mid-sentence with his spork halfway to his mouth. Weather change coming, maybe, he suggested, but his voice had lost some of its usual confidence. The silence lasted for perhaps 2 minutes, though it felt much longer. Then from somewhere in the darkness beyond our firelight came a sound I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't quite a growl, not exactly a screech, something in between, but wrong somehow, like someone trying to imitate animal sounds without ever having heard them properly. Jasper reached for the rifle he'd brought for emergencies. Probably just a bobcat, he said, but we both knew that wasn't true. Bobcats don't make sounds like that. We didn't sleep much that night. The thing outside our camp moved around periodically, never coming into view but making its presence known through broken branches and that awful vocalization. Sometimes it seemed to be testing our perimeter, looking for weak spots. By morning we found deep gouges in the trees surrounding our campsite, not normal claw marks, but precise, almost geometric patterns carved into the bark about 7 feet off the ground. Jasper wanted to press on. We're miles from the nearest exit point, he reasoned. Moving forward to our planned site might be safer than trying to backtrack. I argued for turning back, but he convinced me that we were better off sticking to our original route. The planned site was on higher ground, he said, more defensible. That decision haunts me still. The next day's hike was tense. Every sound made us jump. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threats. The swamp itself felt different, more hostile somehow. The water had taken on an oily sheen, and the vegetation seemed darker, more twisted. We found more of those strange tracks, fresher now, and occasionally glimpsed movement in our peripheral vision that vanished when we turned to look. It was mid-afternoon when I made my fatal mistake. Jasper had stopped to check our position, and I needed to answer nature's call. "Don't go far," he warned, but I wanted privacy. I walked just far enough to be out of sight, finding a relatively dry spot behind a large cypress. That's when I saw it, the clearing. The vegetation had been cleared in an unnaturally perfect circle, maybe 30 feet in diameter. At its center stood an ancient cypress tree, its trunk twisted into shapes that seemed to defy natural growth patterns. Scattered around the base were bones, not just one or two, but dozens of complete skeletons. Some were clearly animal remains, but others were unmistakably human. I should have run, should have called out to Jasper. Instead, I stood there, paralyzed by a mixture of horror and fascination. The bones seemed arranged in a pattern, radiating out from the central tree like spokes on a wheel. Many showed signs of precise cuts, not the random trauma you'd expect from animal attacks, but deliberate, almost surgical marks. The sound that finally broke my trance wasn't loud, just a soft scraping noise from above. I looked up and my world shifted permanently. It clung to the cypress trunk about 20 feet up, a thing that should not exist. In the filtered sunlight, its skin looked like ancient bark, gnarled and gray, stretched over a frame that was almost but not quite humanoid. Its limbs were wrong, too long, too many joints, fingers that extended into foot-long talons. Where a face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of that bark-like skin, but somehow I knew it was looking at me. Time seemed to stop. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The thing on the tree tilted what passed for its head, studying me with that blank face. Then it moved. The speed was impossible. One moment it was on the tree, the next it was dropping to the ground with fluid grace that defied physics. Its limbs unfolded like a grotesque flower blooming, and it rose to its full height, easily 9 or 10 feet tall. I ran. Blind panic took over. I crashed through the undergrowth, barely registering the thorns that tore at my clothes and skin. Behind me I could hear it pursuing, not running exactly, but moving with a terrible efficiency through the swamp. Those wrong limbs seemed perfectly adapted to the terrain, allowing it to flow over and around obstacles that slowed me down. The sounds it made during the chase were worse than anything I'd heard before, a mixture of clicking and that awful screeching, punctuated by what sounded disturbingly like human words spoken backward. My lungs burned, my legs trembled, but pure terror kept me moving. I have no idea how long I ran or in what direction. The swamp became a blur of green and brown, meaningless shapes that I pushed through without thought. At some point I splashed through deeper water and felt something brush against my leg, probably an alligator, but at that moment it seemed like the lesser threat. I found Jasper by pure luck, nearly colliding with him as he was searching for me. One look at my face told him something was terribly wrong. Before I could speak, we both heard it. That clicking sound, closer now, accompanied by the crack of breaking branches. "Run," I managed to gasp. "We have to run." We fled together, Jasper quickly taking the lead since he still had some energy left. He tried to guide us toward where we'd left the four-wheeler, but in our panic, we lost all sense of direction. The thing behind us seemed to be hurting us, sometimes getting closer, sometimes backing off, but always there. The sun was setting when we stumbled onto a maintenance trail. By some miracle, a truck was passing, a Florida Fish and Wildlife vehicle driven by a ranger named Miguel Rodriguez. He took one look at our blood-streaked, mud-covered appearances and immediately radioed for backup. The official report lists us as lost hikers suffering from dehydration and possible heat exhaustion. They found our abandoned four-wheeler 2 days later, but our other gear was never recovered. The rangers searched the area where we claimed to have seen the creature, but found nothing unusual. No clearing, no bones, no strange tracks. Jasper doesn't talk about what happened. He moved back to Colorado and, as far as I know, hasn't set foot in Florida since. I've done research trying to make sense of what we encountered. The closest thing I've found is in Seminole legends about the Stikini, a shape-shifting creature that hunts in the deep swamps. But the descriptions don't quite match what I saw. I've been to therapists, taken medication for PTSD, tried to convince myself it was all a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there. Sometimes late at night I look at satellite images of the Everglades, millions of acres of wilderness where anything could hide. I think about the missing persons reports that pop up every few months, the ones that never get resolved. And I wonder how many others have seen what I saw, have run from that thing in the swamp. How many weren't as lucky as we were? The physical scars have healed, but other things linger. I can't stand the sound of breaking branches. The sight of Spanish moss makes me break out in cold sweats. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can hear that clicking sound, that awful screech that's almost words. I still work in tech, but I've moved to Arizona. There are no swamps here, no thick forests where things can hide. The desert feels safer somehow, everything exposed under the bright sun. But even here, thousands of miles from the Everglades, I never quite shake the feeling that somewhere out there, that faceless thing is waiting, watching, hungry. This is my warning to anyone thinking of venturing deep into the Everglades. Stick to the marked trails, the tourist areas. Don't go wandering off alone. And if you hear that sound, that terrible clicking screech that sounds almost like words, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because some things in this world aren't meant to be understood, and some corners of wilderness should remain unexplored. The truth is, we think we've tamed this world, mapped every inch of it, explained away all its mysteries. But there are places where the wild still rules, where ancient things still lurk in the shadows. I know because I've seen one, and every night I pray I never see it again.